So far, we learned the law of the supply and the law of the demand. It seems like we isolate the supplier from the consumer. And also, we haven't discussing for the price. When you go to Walmart, we didn't see for one product have multiple price. So for each product, they only have one price, or we call it market price. So far we don't know how that price are decided. So in our flow chart, circular flow chart, we learned that circular flow chart, we learned that the consumer and the supply, they has to interact, but at this point we haven't discussed it. So first I want to mention the purpose of the drawing the supply and the demand curve is to see how markets answer the basic question: what, how, and for whom. Supply and the demand curve also explain how price are determined in the market. So only one price and quantity are compatible with the existing intentions of the both buyers and the sellers. So which means at that price and the supply are decided to supply certain amount of goods, and that certain amount of goods is the amount of goods consumer want to buy and want to pay the same price. So that is the market price, and the market is the market quantity, equilibrium quantity. So in this video, we will focus on how the market decides the market price and market supply and market demand. So we call it equilibrium. So what is the definition for equilibrium? So the equilibrium is only one price and quantity combination is compatible with the intention of the both buyer and seller. So the price at which the quantity of the goods demanded is given the time period equal to the quantity supplied. So which means if the market will charge that price, and the producer, let's say, want to produce 10 ice cream, and under that price we have exactly 10 consumer want to buy it. So that is called equilibrium. So in order to show it on the chart, we only need to put our supply and demand curve in the same chart, and the intersection here, the intersection of supply and demand, that is our equilibrium point, and the vertical value will be our equilibrium price, and the value on the horizontal axis, QE, is the equilibrium quantity. So that's the price we see in the Walmart, and you see the soda $2.5 in the cooler. So that is the equilibrium price for a single bottle of the Coca-Cola. And so that is how the market price got decided. So one tips. So the reason we are before we are learning this part, we look at the supply and demand curve. Is learning the supply and demand curve will help us to easily identify where is our equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So how can we characterize the equilibrium point? So at the equilibrium points, we will not be able to see the shortage. So which means at that price, the amount consumer wants is exactly the same amount that the producer produced. So nobody will left over. And also there is no surplus exists. That means the amount of the producer produce exactly the consumer wants, and there is no actual product left on the market. So in other words, if we try to use the formula to express it, that means the quantity demanded equal to the quantity supplied, and also equal to the equilibrium quantity. So at this point, its equilibrium means the price actually will not change until if one of the curve will shift. So the PE, the equilibrium price, is pretty stabilized, so they will never change unless one of the factor, the determining of the producing a supply or determining of the demand change. So that is the characteristic of the equilibrium. So at equilibrium, what is going to happen for the consumer and the producer's behavior? So the market reach equilibrium because the buyer acts on their demand behavior, and they will raise price, buy less, and then vice versa. And also the seller act on their supply behavior, price rise, supply more, and vice versa. And so at this point, there is no one is in charge. So no one is in charge. They are happy about each other. So the market mechanism lead the market to equilibrium and signals the desired outcome at the equilibrium price. And the quantity demanded equal to the quantity supplied at equilibrium price. So as I keep kind of repeating myself, the reason is I want you to keep in mind. So at equilibrium point, suppliers happy, buyers happy, and they're very happy in that state. The amount of the supply will not change, the amount of the price will not change. So that's why we call it equilibrium price. So how about a certain situation, we do have the market surplus at a short period of time, and as we said here is they will naturally coming back to the equilibrium. So now we're going to learn how we're going to coming back to the equilibrium point. How we're going to come back to the equilibrium point. So let's see, we have the market surplus. So before I were talking about market surplus, I have to explain what is surplus. So market surplus means the amount by which quantity supplied, which is QS, exceeds the quantity demanded at a given price. And so in other words, we have too many products on the market, but we don't have enough demand. So can you find an example? So I don't know how many of you like the A&F clothes. I'm kind of a fan for the A&F. So if you go to look at their clothes, I always be fascinated by how much clothes they sell and how much clothes they have in the store. So actually, I never believe they can sell all of their clothes. That's for sure. So they will have the market surplus. So more supply than the demand. More supply than the demand. So now here we're going to learn if we do have the market surplus and how the market itself will resolving this problem. So let's see when we're going to have surplus. So when the price is too high and we will have the surplus. So look at this chart. So orange line is demand and blue line is surplus. And so let's see the market price at this point is P high. And so I know, as I mentioned about A&F, so you know if you buy the clothes at their original price, you know you are waste your money because eventually they're actually going to have discounts. So their original price is pretty high. So at that point, what we see is we have surplus. And how do I know it's surplus? So the intersection between Q high and Q and our demand curve will equal to this dot. Will be this dot. Corresponding to this dot, we will find that the value on the horizontal axis is QD. So that is how much are demanded by the consumer if the price is P high. And under the same price, if we look at the P high's intersection with the supply curve, and we got this point. And corresponding to this point, we can find their horizontal value is QS. So the QS is here, and you know on the scale, the value on the right-hand side is usually always larger than the value on the left-hand side. So QS is larger than QD. So the quantity supplied is larger than the quantity demanded. So that's why we have the market surplus. So one of the reasons, as I said, causing the market surplus is the price is too high. So the price is too high. So that's why we have surplus. QS larger than QD, we have surplus. So now, as we said, if we have equilibrium point, is because any disequilibrium will eventually coming back to the equilibrium point if the market is efficient. So let's see the buyer and the seller, how their behavior gonna kick in. So think about, as I said, A&F, they're overpriced their product. And for me, I never buy the full price clothes from them. I always wait. And I know after a certain period of time, holiday season, they may have 50% off, 40% off. If starts off season, they even have 70% off on, or even 50% off, and given the 50% off, they give you extra 70% off. So that's a really great deal. And why they are doing that? Yes, decreasing the price and will allow them to matching the quantity supply and quantity demand. So that's what will happen here is, so they will both try to interact in order to sell those surplus products. And the producer has to decrease their price. And then if they decrease the price, we understand that the demand will increase. So they decrease the price and the demand increase. So when the price dropped from P high to PE. So what we see is first, our demand and the supply will all merge. at the QE point. So the price fall to equilibrium price to resolve the market surplus issues, And so, and also some student might say, okay, how the producer kind of like reduce the amount of product they produce, because originally QS, now QE, because if we have surplus, and so if for some store they might not be able to sell all of the clothes, so they either has to reduce the amount of clothes, send it back to the headquarters, or they just close the store. So that's pretty normal in nowadays business. So you just shut down your business. So by having those behavior, that will eventually decrease the supply. So that's why the QS decreased to QE. But since the price also decreased, so the quantity demand will increase from QD to QE. So that's how market responds to the market surplus. So remember, market surplus is in equilibrium. So now let's look at the opposite scenario. So if the market has shortage, so the shortage is opposite from market situation compared with the market surplus. So first, let's define what is market shortage. So the amount by which quantity demanded exceeded quantity supplied at a given price, so exceeded demand. So which means more demand than the supply. So when we will see the market shortage? So when the price is too low, and we will see the shortage. So if I try to find it using the chart indicating this shortage. So since the price low causing the shortage, so let's define a price called P low, which is under my equilibrium point, PE. So under the P low, so the intersection between the P low and the supply curve, we ending up this point. And corresponding to this point, we got the horizontal value is QS. So this is the under the peak low, how much the producer want to produce is QS. However, under the P low, in the intersection between P low and the demand curve, we ending up this point. And the horizontal value corresponding to this point is QD. So which means under the P low, the quantity demanded is here. So obviously the QD is larger than the QS, so that is called shortage. So now the buyer and the seller behavior will kick in. So now how they respond? So since we have shortage, so the producer, some potential producer will say, oh, wait a second. We have the market here. People need more products. At this point, the current supplier cannot meet the demand, so they would jump into the market and to producing more. So they will try to producing more, and so which means if they try to producing more and they were lifting, this low price goes up a little bit, so we have more producer. So at the same time, since we have shortage, so the consumer will fighting for the product. So for instance, your neighbor want to pay $10 for ice cream, and then you say, I'm so thirsty, I want to buy it too, but they only sell one ice cream, and then you say, I want it too, I want to pay $12, and then your neighbor say, I want more, I want $14, and so you can see each other fighting for the limited product. So what's happening is they actually will drive the product price up. So the demand side will drive the products up as well. But since you will find as the price goes up and the less and less people can afford it, so that's why we see the QD will decrease as well. The quantity demanded will decrease as the price goes up. So eventually they will meet at this equilibrium point. So the supply equal to the demand. So at this point, and so the quantity supplied equal to the quantity demanded, and then they were really hard to move far away from this equilibrium point. So that is the two type of the in equilibrium and how the market will respond to changing this equilibrium back to the equilibrium. So after we're looking at how the market deal with this equilibrium, and we have to look at what will causing the price to change. So the price change when equilibrium is upset and due to a shift in demand curve or due to a shift in supply curve. So after the shift, the supply or a shortage is created and the market mechanism begins to find the new equilibrium. So that's another situation when the equilibrium price will change. So sometimes you see like my husband like applesauce. It was used to be $1.98. Now it's $2.50. And we do see the equilibrium price is changing. So why those change gonna happen? Why the equilibrium price change? It is really because the shifting of the curves, shifting the curves. So let's see how shifting the curve creating a shortage and a surplus, and then how the market adjusts to changing the price so that they will back to the new equilibrium point. So let's see the demand change. So let's see the demand change. So the buyer behavior changed, demand shift to the right. So let's see, for instance, the consumer after they watching kale, the doctor said that eating kale will help you to prevent from the cancer. So more consumer likes it. We learn the determinant of demand. So hearing this kind of news, we're changing the consumer taste. So they become more favorable to the product, the kale. So then they will causing the demand for kale shift to the right. So original equilibrium price is P1. The original price is a P1. However, if they still sell at a P1 under the new demand curve, QD, and we see the quantity supply is Q1, but quantity demanded will be quantity demanded will become here. So what happened here is the quantity demanded is larger than the quantity supply, Q1, we're creating a shortage. So in order to close this shortage, and what happened is, and the price has to goes up. So if we have shortage and more people fighting on the product, they being on the product, they eventually has to driving the price up. So once the price goes up, and when they will stop at the new intersection. So this intersection will be between supply and the D2. So the new equilibrium price will established, and the same as well as the new equilibrium quantity. So the Q2 become the new equilibrium quantity, and the P2 will be the new equilibrium price. So that is when the demand change increase, and how will that affect the equilibrium point. So now we will look at the opposite scenario. How about the demand will decrease? So for instance, the other 2 years ago, there is a lady sued the Subway because they find that the substance the material people use to making the yoga mat, so they found equivalent substance were added to the Subway's bread. So after you hearing this news, what do you respond? Yes, a freak out, right? So you will reduce your taste, you become less favorable to the Subway. So in other words, the buyer will decrease their demand on the Subway. So what we see is the demand curve will shift to the left, shift from D1 to D2. So now if the original equilibrium price is P1, so under the P1, what we see is under the if the producer is still charging P1 and under the new demand curve, and so we will see the intersection between P1 and the D2 is here, and the horizontal value is here. So the Q1 is how much they want to supply, and this new equilibrium point here, a new value here is the quantity demanded by the consumer. So obviously we will have surplus, which is here, that amount surplus. And so how can we close this gap? How can we close this gap? In order to closing this gap, as we mentioned, if we have surplus, the best practice for the producer is decrease price. So actually, what happened is as they decrease in the price, and so the point will move along the supply curve, and eventually will stop at the intersection between the new demand curve D2 with the supply curve. So this will be our new equilibrium point, and under this new equilibrium point, the price has already dropped from P1 to P2, and as well as the equilibrium supply would dropped from Q1 to Q2. Again, it's not a surprise. After that news about the Subway's bread poison substance, and so the Subway actually experienced a significantly sale drop. So the decrease the supply will decrease the market. So now let's look at how the supply change will affect the equilibrium price. So let's say the supply will increase, because the technology advanced. So think about the smartphone. So as the technology got advanced, and so per week, actually the manufacturer will be able to produce in more smartphone. So that means the supply curve will shift to the right. So what we see on the chart is S1 will shift to S2, shift to the right. So we'll able to produce in more smartphone. So let's say the producer is still charging the price as P1. So what does this mean? So if they still charging the P1, the quantity demanded will be Q1 because that's the intersection between the price and quantity and the demand curve. However, the intersection between the price and the supply S2 will be here, and corresponding to this point, and we can find the value of the horizontal value for quantity supplied. So obviously it's on the right hand side of the Q1, so which means we have more supply than the demand. So in another word, we are having the surplus. So we learned in the previous a couple slides, if we have the market surplus, in order to close this gap, and the price has to be dropped. So the price has to be dropped. So in other words, so we have surplus. There's some producer cannot sell their product. They may has to close their factory. So the supply will slowly decrease. And so, and also in order to sell their more product, the factory has to reduce their price to sell to the consumer. So you will see the selling point start to move along my demand curve. And when will they stop? When they will stop at the intersection between S2 and the D. So that will be our new equilibrium point. So at the new equilibrium point, what we found is the price has already dropped from the P1 to P2, and at the same time, the quantity supplied, the equilibrium quantity actually rise from Q1 to Q2 in order to close that surplus gap. So that is the scenario when the supply increase. So let's look at the opposite case. Supply decreases. So let's see the oil price goes up, and how will that affect our transportation industry? And so if the oil price goes up, and the seller will find, the producer will find that it's so hard to run a transportation company business, so the supply will decrease. So if the supply decrease, we learn the supply curve will shift from S1 to S2. So the supply will decrease. So you can see if the price are still being charged under the P1, and so although the demand will still stick on the Q1 because the demand curve, the intersection between P1 and the demand is still be Q1. However, the intersection between the supply and the quantity, the price changing to this spot, and under this corresponding to this spot, the horizontal value will be here. So which is on the left hand side of the Q1, so which means it's going to be smaller than the quantity demanded. So in this case, the market actually will have shortage. And in the previous class, we already learned, in the previous slides, we already know that if we have shortage, the best practice is the market will rise the price eventually to rise the price. So why it has to rise the price? So think about if we have shortage, and so the consumer will bid on the product, try to rise the price, and so at the same time, for the producer, and more they will understand that the production cost increased, and it has to cover part of the increase of production costs. So they will also have the motivation to increase their price. So when will they stop? So the equilibrium point will move along the curve when they will find their new equilibrium point. So when they find the intersection between the supply S2 and the D, which is here. So this will be the new equilibrium point. So what we found is under the new equilibrium point, the price has already increased from the original one, the P1 to P2. If you look at the equilibrium quantity, it has already dropped from Q1 to Q2 in order to close that shortage gap. So let's summarize what we learned about this equilibrium and how the market change and the price changes. So the price will change when a market is disequilibrium. If we have shortage, keep in mind price will rise. If we have surplus, and price will fall. So a shift is in either demand or supply cause the price to change. But keep in mind, a price change does not cause the demand curve to shift or the demand curve or supply curve to shift. So you can see shifting the curve event definitely will causing changing the price. But the only change in the price, you have to know the eventually will go back to the equilibrium point, original equilibrium point. It will not causing the shifting of the supply and the demand curve, supply and the demand curve.